The tundra stretched endlessly before us, a vast white plain broken only by the wind-sculpted ridges of snow that caught the pale morning light and turned it gold. The nomads moved in a long line across the frozen expanse, their horses stepping carefully, their felt-covered carts creaking under loads of everything needed for survival in this merciless land. The air was so cold it burned the lungs, so dry it cracked the lips, so still that every sound carried for miles. My name is Daniel, and I was there that morning, the stranger walking at the rear of the column, the outsider who had stumbled into their world and been given a chance to survive. What I didn't know then was that this journey across the ice would teach me not just how to endure the cold, but how to find warmth in ways I had never imagined. In the press of bodies sleeping together through the long dark nights, in the shared breath and shared trust that made life possible when nature offered only death. I had been a merchant's clerk in the southern cities, a man of letters and ledgers, comfortable in stone buildings with fireplaces and feather beds. My journey north had been motivated by ambition and ignorance in equal measure, following trade routes that promised profit from the exotic goods of the steppe peoples. But winter had come early and fierce. My hired guides had abandoned me when the first serious snows fell, and I had found myself alone in a landscape that had no mercy for the unprepared. I would have died within days, frozen or starved, if the nomads had not found me wandering in circles, my feet wrapped in rags, my hands blue with frostbite, my mind already beginning to slip into the fatal sleep that cold brings. If you want to hear stories of survival in the world's harshest places, of ancient peoples who mastered environments that would kill modern humans in hours, of wisdom passed down through generations about how to not just survive but thrive where nature seems most hostile, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. These stories will change how you think about human resilience, about community, about what it truly means to adapt and belong. They had wrapped me in furs, placed me on a cart, and continued their migration without discussion or debate. It was only later, much later, that I learned how radical that decision had been, how much it had cost them in resources and risk to take in a stranger who could offer nothing in return. But that was their way, I would discover, a code of hospitality born from the understanding that, in this land, today's rescuer might be tomorrow's rescued, that survival was never guaranteed, and help must be given freely because someday you would need it just as desperately. The leader of this group was a man named Timur, whose name meant iron and whose character matched it perfectly. He was perhaps 50 years old, his face weathered by decades of sun and wind and cold, his body lean and strong despite his age. He spoke little, communicated mostly through gestures and looks, but every decision he made was obeyed without question because his judgment had been proven over and over by the survival of his people. He rode at the front of the column on a shaggy steppe pony that seemed as tough as its rider, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, reading signs in the landscape that were invisible to me. His wife was a woman named Zara, which meant golden, though her hair was black as a raven's wing, and only her heart, as I would learn, deserved such a precious name. She was strong in the way that steppe women were strong, capable of any task, from butchering a sheep to delivering a baby to navigating by stars. She had been the one to notice my frost-bitten hands, to prepare the poultices of animal fat and herbs that saved my fingers, to insist that I be given proper clothing from their limited supplies. Her kindness was practical rather than sentimental, but no less real for that. There was a young man named Altan, whose name meant golden like his mother's, who became my teacher and interpreter in those early days. He had learned some Russian from traders, and I had learned some Russian in the cities, so we could communicate haltingly, filling in gaps with gestures and patience. He was perhaps 25 years old, already a skilled horseman and hunter, with a quick laugh and an endless curiosity about the world beyond the steppes. He took it upon himself to teach me, not out of obligation, but because he seemed to find my ignorance both amusing and challenging. The eldest member of the group was called Batu, which meant strong, a name he had earned in youth and carried into old age with dignity. He was so old that no one knew exactly how many winters he had survived. His face a landscape of wrinkles, his hands gnarled like tree roots, but his mind sharp and his memory a living library of everything the people needed to know. He rode in a cart, wrapped in layers of felt and fur, and in the evenings he told stories, not for entertainment, but for education, passing down the accumulated wisdom of generations. There was also a man named Yoshi, younger than Timur, but older than Altan, who watched me with suspicion in those first weeks. He questioned the decision to rescue me, argued that I would consume resources without contributing, suggested more than once that I should be left behind if I couldn't keep pace. His skepticism wasn't cruel but practical, the voice of caution that every group needs, the one willing to speak uncomfortable truths. What he taught me, without intending to, was that acceptance had to be earned, that belonging was not automatic but achieved through proving your worth. And there were children, half a dozen ranging from toddlers to adolescents, including a girl of about 8 named Kulin, which meant wild horse. She was Altan's younger sister, born during a migration like this one, tough as leather despite her small size. She watched me constantly in those early days, curious about this strange man who didn't know how to do anything useful, and she became, without either of us planning it, one of my most important teachers, showing me through example and patient demonstration the 1,000 small skills that made life possible. As we traveled across the tundra, I began to understand that I had entered a world with completely different rules than the one I had left. Here, there were no permanent buildings, no stored wealth, no individual ownership of land. Everything the people had, they carried with them. Their homes were felt tents called yurts that could be assembled or disassembled in less than an hour. Their possessions were limited to what was essential for survival. Their wealth was measured in animals, horses and sheep and goats that provided transportation, food, clothing, and milk. And their survival depended entirely on mobility, on following the herds and the grass, on reading weather and terrain, on making constant small adaptations to changing conditions. The cold was unlike anything I had experienced in the cities. This was not the damp cold of winter rain or the bite of wind through narrow streets. This was a cold so profound it seemed to have physical weight, pressing down on you, seeping through every gap in clothing, stealing heat from your body with relentless efficiency. The nomads dressed in layers of wool and felt and fur, each layer serving a specific purpose, the inner layers wicking moisture away from skin, the outer layers breaking wind and shedding snow. I was given similar clothing, pieced together from spare items, and I learned quickly that proper dress was not about comfort, but about survival. One mistake, one gap in coverage, and frostbite would strike in minutes. But what surprised me most, what seemed almost impossible at first, was how they slept in such cold. In the cities, I had slept alone in a bed, under blankets, behind walls and doors that provided privacy and protection from the elements. Here, privacy was a luxury that couldn't be afforded, and protection came not from structures, but from collective body heat. At night, inside the yurts, the entire family slept together on felt mats arranged around the central fire, bodies pressed close, sharing warmth and breath. Children slept between adults, the elderly positioned nearest the fire, everyone layered under thick felt blankets and furs, creating a collective organism that generated and conserved heat through the long, frozen nights. I was given a place in Timur's yurt, positioned between Altan and one of the older boys, and that first night I lay awake for hours, uncomfortable with the closeness, with the sound of breathing all around me, with the complete lack of personal space. But I was warm, warmer than I had been since entering this frozen land, and gradually I understood that this was not a compromise forced by circumstance, but a solution perfected over generations, a way of sleeping that turned vulnerability into strength by making survival a collective achievement. Altan noticed my discomfort and spoke quietly in the darkness, his voice just loud enough for me to hear. "In the cities, you sleep alone?" he asked in his halting Russian. I confirmed that yes. In the cities, people had their own rooms, their own beds, walls between them and others. He was quiet for a moment, processing this strange information. "But how do you stay warm?" he finally asked. "And how do you know you are safe?" "Here, if danger comes, we all wake together. We protect together. Alone, you are weak. Together, we are strong." Simple words, but they contained a philosophy I was only beginning to grasp. The days took on a rhythm dictated by the needs of the animals and the demands of travel. We woke before dawn, dismantled the camp with practiced efficiency, loaded everything onto carts and pack animals, and began moving. We traveled for perhaps 6 hours, then stopped to rest the animals and eat a cold meal of dried meat and cheese and mare's milk. Then we traveled again until the light began to fail, at which point Timur would select a campsite based on criteria I couldn't yet read, and we would set up the yurts and build fires and tend the animals before the true darkness and cold descended. I was given tasks appropriate to my limited skills, starting with the simplest and most tedious. I helped gather dung for fuel, the dried droppings of horses and sheep that burned slowly and provided steady heat. I helped carry water from whatever source we could find, melting snow when no liquid water was available. I helped with the animals, learning to recognize signs of distress or injury, learning which ones were gentle and which required careful handling. Every task was an education, every mistake a lesson, and gradually my hands developed calluses. My body adapted to the constant physical work. My mind began to see patterns I had been blind to before. What I learned most fundamentally was that survival here required not individual heroism, but coordinated group effort. Everything was done collectively. Men and women worked together on tasks that needed strength or skill. Children contributed according to their abilities, watching animals, gathering fuel, helping prepare food. The elderly offered guidance and judgment based on experience. Everyone had a role. Everyone contributed, and the community functioned as a single organism with many parts, each essential to the health of the whole. Batu, the ancient storyteller, began teaching me through his evening narratives. He spoke in the old language of the steppes, and Altan translated for me, though much was lost in the process. But I listened carefully, understanding that these stories were not just entertainment, but encoded knowledge, practical wisdom wrapped in memorable narrative form. He told of the first people who ventured onto the steppes, of how they learned to follow the herds, of the mistakes that had cost lives and the innovations that had saved them. He told of terrible winters that had killed many, and of wise leaders whose decisions had preserved the people. He told of the relationship between humans and animals, how horses had chosen to partner with people, how that partnership had made possible a way of life that could thrive in lands that would otherwise be uninhabitable. One story, he told, affected me deeply. It was about a man from far away, not unlike myself, who had joined the nomads and struggled to adapt. This man had been proud, Batu said, had believed his way of living was superior, had resisted learning the nomad ways. And one winter, when he was caught out alone during a sudden storm, his pride had killed him because he didn't know the techniques that would have saved his life. The land does not care about your pride, Batu concluded, his old eyes fixed on me. The land teaches or it kills. Those who listen survive. Those who refuse to listen die. This is the oldest law. The message was clear, delivered with the gentleness of a grandfather, but with unmistakable force. I was being tested, evaluated, and my survival depended not just on physical endurance, but on my willingness to shed my old assumptions and embrace new ways. I nodded my understanding, and something shifted in the old man's expression, a slight softening that might have been approval. The weather worsened as we traveled, the cold deepening, the wind picking up, snow beginning to fall in swirling curtains that reduced visibility to almost nothing. Timur kept us moving, trusting his internal compass and his reading of subtle signs to maintain our direction. The horses plodded forward with heads lowered, the carts creaked and groaned, the people wrapped their faces and kept walking. No one complained, no one questioned, everyone simply endured, because endurance was what survival required. We made camp that night in the partial shelter of a low ridge, the yurts erected with extra care, the felt coverings secured with additional ropes against the wind. Inside, we huddled close, the fire built up higher than usual, everyone sharing body heat as the storm raged outside. I lay pressed between Altan and young Kulan, feeling their warmth seeping into me, hearing their steady breathing, and for the first time I felt something that wasn't just gratitude for being alive, but a sense of belonging, a connection to these people who had taken me in and were teaching me to survive. In the morning, the storm had passed, but the landscape was transformed. Snow drifted deep in some places and blown bare in others, the familiar landmarks obscured or eliminated. Timur surveyed the situation, consulted briefly with Yochi and Batu, then made a decision. We would remain here for a day, letting the animals rest and recover, giving people time to repair equipment and restore strength. It was a tactical pause, a recognition that pushing too hard could break both animals and people, that knowing when to stop was as important as knowing when to move. During that rest day, Zara took me aside and began teaching me practical skills I desperately needed. She showed me how to maintain and repair the felt boots that protected feet from frostbite, how to recognize when leather was becoming too dry and brittle, how to apply fat to keep it supple. She showed me how to layer clothing properly, how to adjust for different levels of activity, how to stay warm while working without overheating and sweating, which would turn deadly when activity stopped. She taught me to read my own body, to recognize the early signs of frostbite or hypothermia, to take action before damage became irreversible. "The cold is honest," she said through Altan's translation. "It does not lie or deceive. It tells you clearly what will happen if you make mistakes. You must learn to listen to these warnings, to respect them, to respond appropriately. Many people die not because the cold is too strong, but because they ignore its warnings until too late. Her teaching was patient but firm, correcting my mistakes without judgment, showing me again and again until I understood. I felt clumsy and stupid, my hands fumbling with tasks that children could do easily, but she never showed impatience, just steady determination that I would learn what I needed to know. Altan continued my education in other areas, teaching me about the animals, about reading tracks in the snow, about the different types of cold, and how they required different responses. He taught me words in his language, not systematically but practically, naming things as we encountered them, building my vocabulary through use. He taught me the social rules that governed the group, who could speak at certain times, how decisions were made, what behaviors were expected, and what were forbidden. What surprised me was the complexity of their social structure. This was not a simple or primitive society, but a sophisticated one with elaborate rules and customs, with hierarchies based on age and skill and proven judgment, with mechanisms for resolving disputes and making collective decisions. Timur led, but he led through consultation and consensus, listening to advice from elders and specialists before deciding. Major decisions were discussed openly, with everyone able to speak, though the weight given to different voices varied based on experience and wisdom. I learned that generosity was not optional but mandatory, that anyone with surplus was expected to share, that hoarding was seen as not just selfish but dangerous to group survival. I learned that reputation mattered more than material wealth, that being known as reliable and skilled and generous was the highest form of status. I learned that children were raised communally, with all adults responsible for all children, teaching and correcting and protecting them as needed. I learned that the elderly were honored and cared for, their needs prioritized, their wisdom sought constantly. As weeks passed and we continued our migration across the frozen tundra, I felt myself changing in ways both physical and mental. My body hardened, muscles developing from constant work, hands growing tough, face becoming weathered by wind and sun. But the deeper changes were in how I thought and what I valued. I stopped mentally calculating the monetary value of everything, stopped thinking in terms of individual profit and loss, stopped seeing nature as something to be conquered or exploited. I began to think in terms of the group's needs, to value skills over possessions, to see the landscape not as hostile, but as a teacher offering lessons to those willing to learn. The breakthrough in my acceptance came unexpectedly, during a crisis that tested everyone. We had been traveling across a particularly flat and featureless section of tundra when the weather suddenly turned. The sky darkened with terrifying speed. The wind rose from gentle breeze to howling gale in minutes, and the temperature plummeted so rapidly that exposed skin began to freeze almost instantly. Timur immediately called a halt, shouting orders that sent everyone into coordinated emergency response. The yurts couldn't be properly erected in such wind, so instead we created emergency shelters, using the carts as windbreaks and stretching felt over them to create enclosed spaces. The animals were hobbled and turned into the wind, their thick coats and survival instincts better suited to this than anything humans could provide. People worked with desperate efficiency, knowing that speed meant survival, every second counting. I worked alongside Altan and Yochi, holding felt against the wind while they secured it, my hands going numb despite gloves, my face feeling like it was being cut by 1,000 knives. At one point, the felt was torn from our hands by a gust, and it began to blow away. Without thinking, I dove after it, knowing somehow that its loss could mean someone's death, that every piece of shelter material was precious. I caught it after a scrambling chase, held it against the ground while the wind tried to rip it away, and dragged it back to where Jochi was waiting. He took it from me, our eyes meeting for just a moment, and I saw recognition there, acknowledgement that I had acted correctly, had put the group's needs ahead of my own safety. We survived that storm, everyone accounted for, no serious injuries, but it was close. Huddled in the makeshift shelters, pressed even closer together than usual, we waited out the worst of it. I was squeezed between bodies, barely able to move, breathing air that was heavy with moisture and the smell of unwashed humans and animals, and I felt a strange peace. This was survival at its most basic, stripped of everything unnecessary, reduced to the essential core of mutual dependence and shared warmth. When the storm finally passed and we emerged to assess the damage, Yochi approached me. He spoke in his own language, words I didn't understand, but his tone had changed from suspicious to something closer to acceptance. Altan translated. He says you acted well during the storm. You did not panic. You worked. You thought of the group. This is good. Simple praise, but it meant more to me than any compliment I had received in my previous life. From that day forward, I was treated differently, not as a burden to be tolerated, but as a contributing member of the group. I was given more responsible tasks, included in discussions about route and timing, asked my opinion even though my knowledge was still limited. I had passed some invisible threshold, proven myself in the crucible of shared danger, earned a place through action rather than words. Batu called me to sit with him one evening, and through Altan's translation, we had a conversation that clarified much. You came to us dead, he said. Your body was alive, but you were dead in all ways that matter. You knew nothing of how to live in this land. You were like a newborn, helpless and ignorant. But you have learned. You have allowed yourself to die to your old ways and be reborn into new ones. This is wisdom. Many cannot do this. They cling to what they know, even when what they know will kill them. You have been flexible, like the willow that bends in the wind rather than breaking. He paused, his ancient eyes studying me. Now you must make a choice. When we reach the spring grounds, there will be trading posts. You could return to your people, to your old life. Or you could stay with us, continue learning, become truly one of us. No one will force you either way, but you must decide who you are and where you belong. His words haunted me as we continued our journey. Who was I now? I had been Daniel the clerk, comfortable in cities, skilled at reading and writing and calculation. But that person seemed distant, almost unreal. The person I was becoming was someone different, someone defined by different skills and values, someone who found meaning in cooperation rather than competition, who measured worth by contribution to the group rather than individual achievement. The sleeping arrangements, which had seemed so strange and uncomfortable at first, had become natural and even comforting. I no longer lay awake feeling awkward about the closeness. Instead, I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the sound of breathing around me, warmed by the heat of bodies, secure in the knowledge that we watched over each other through the long, dark hours. I had learned that true sleep, the deep, restful kind that restored body and spirit, came not from physical comfort, but from security, from the profound trust that others would keep you safe while you were vulnerable. I had learned the practical techniques that made such sleeping possible. How to arrange the felt mats and furs for maximum warmth. How to position bodies to optimize heat distribution and air circulation. How to adjust layers through the night as the fire burned down and temperature dropped. How to wake when necessary without disturbing others. How to share space without conflict, respecting the small protocols that prevented friction in such close quarters. These were skills as important as any other. Knowledge that enabled survival in conditions that would otherwise be fatal. As spring approached, and the tundra slowly began to change, the snow melting in patches, the sun staying higher and longer in the sky, the migration took on new purpose. We were racing the season, trying to reach the spring grounds where grass would emerge and animals could graze, where the annual gathering of clans would happen, where decisions about the coming year would be made. Timur pushed us harder, sensing that we needed to arrive before the best camping spots were taken, before the choicest pastures were claimed. We reached the spring grounds on a day of brilliant sunshine and mild wind, arriving to find several other groups already there. Yurts erected across a broad valley, animals spread across the greening grass, people moving among the camps in the complex dance of greeting and negotiation and renewal of bonds. It was a transformation from the isolation of winter travel to the vitality of community gathering, and I watched in fascination as Timur's group was welcomed, as news was shared, as relationships were renewed. I was an object of curiosity, this outsider who had traveled with Timur through the winter, and many came to examine me, to ask questions, to assess whether I was worthy of the resources that had been invested in my survival. I was introduced as Altan's student, as someone learning the nomad ways, and I saw the skepticism in many eyes, the doubt that an outsider could truly adapt, the suspicion that I was merely using them for temporary survival before returning to my own people. But those who knew me, the members of Timur's group, spoke in my defense. Yochi, surprisingly, was the most vocal, describing how I had chased the felt during the storm, how I had worked without complaint, how I had learned quickly. Zara spoke of my progress in practical skills. Altan spoke of my willingness to listen and learn. And Batu, whose word carried weight far beyond Timur's immediate group, spoke of my flexibility and respect for knowledge. The gathering lasted for several weeks, a time of trading and socializing and matchmaking, of councils and discussions about grazing territories and potential threats, of ceremonies and celebrations that marked the survival of another winter. I participated as much as I was allowed, helping with communal tasks, watching the complex social interactions, continuing my education in the ways of the people who had saved me. During this time, I met a woman named Tuya, whose name meant Ray of Light, and who lived with another clan that had wintered in a different territory. She was perhaps 30 years old, a widow whose husband had died 2 winters before, childless but skilled in all the crafts that made her valuable to her group. We were drawn to each other through shared tasks and chance encounters, and gradually, through conversations facilitated by translators, we discovered compatibility and affection. Altan noticed and teased me, but gently, and he spoke to Tuya's family on my behalf, explaining my situation, vouching for my character and potential. Timur and Zara were consulted, and they gave their approval, understanding that a wife would further bind me to the nomad way of life, would complete my transformation from outsider to member. Negotiations were conducted, gifts were exchanged, and before the gathering ended, Tuya and I were married in a ceremony that was brief but meaningful. witnessed by both our communities, blessed by the elders. When Timur's group prepared to depart for the summer pastures, Tuya came with us, her belongings loaded on a cart, her few animals added to our herd, her skills and knowledge welcomed by Zara and the other women. She and I were given a section of Timur's yurt for privacy, though privacy remained relative, and she began teaching me things that Altan and Zara could not. The intimate details of daily life, the language spoken between husband and wife, the deep patterns of nomad culture that could only be learned through full immersion. That summer was a time of abundance and joy. We moved to high pastures where grass grew thick and animals fattened, where the weather was gentle and work was less desperate than it had been in winter. I learned new skills, helping with the shearing of sheep, with the making of felt from wool, with the preparation of mare's milk into the fermented drink that was staple and celebration combined. I learned to ride better, to manage the herds, to track animals across open land. I learned songs and games, the cultural expressions that bound the community together beyond mere survival. Tuya taught me with patience and affection, correcting my mistakes with laughter rather than criticism, showing me the thousand small details that marked a true member of the community. Through her, my language skills improved dramatically, and I began to dream in her language rather than my own, a sign that my mind was completing the transformation my body and hands had begun months before. When autumn came and we began moving toward winter grounds, I worked alongside everyone else, no longer the clumsy outsider, but a competent member of the group. I helped dismantle and reassemble yurts, load and unload carts, manage animals, make decisions about route and timing. I had skills now, real and practical, and I contributed meaningfully to our collective survival. That second winter was different from the first. I was no longer learning the basics but refining techniques, developing judgment, becoming someone others could rely on. When storms came, I knew what to do. When equipment broke, I could repair it. When decisions had to be made, my opinion was sought and considered. And when we slept in the close quarters of the yurt, I was no longer uncomfortable but grateful, understanding that this way of sleeping was not a compromise but a triumph, a solution to the challenge of sleeping in deadly cold that demonstrated human ingenuity and social cooperation. Tuya became pregnant that winter, and the entire group celebrated, understanding that new life was the ultimate validation of our success, the promise that the community would continue. Zara took special care of her, sharing knowledge about pregnancy and childbirth, preparing herbs and making plans. I was nervous and excited, feeling the weight of new responsibility, understanding that I was now fully committed to this life, that there would be no going back even if I wanted to. My daughter was born in early spring, as we traveled toward the gathering grounds, delivered in the yurt with Zara and Tuya's mother attending, while I waited outside with the other men, listening to the sounds and praying to gods I was still learning about. When I was finally called in to meet her, this tiny red-faced creature wrapped in soft felt, I felt something shift in my chest, an expansion of identity and purpose that completed my transformation. I was no longer just Daniel, no longer just an adopted member of Timur's group. I was a father, a husband, a provider, a member of a community with obligations and relationships that stretched into the future. We named her Oyun, which meant wisdom, hoping she would grow to embody that quality. And as I held her, feeling her warmth and breathing her smell, I understood with absolute certainty that I would never return to my old life. that I had found something here that was more valuable than any wealth or comfort or status I had once pursued. Years passed, measured by migrations and seasons, by winters survived and summers celebrated. Oyun grew, learning the ways of her people from birth, riding before she could walk properly, speaking the language of the steppes as her native tongue, embodying the hybrid of cultures that I had become. A son followed, then another daughter, and I became a father of 3, a man of substance in the community, someone whose advice was sought, whose skills were valued, whose word carried weight. I took on teaching responsibilities, particularly with the rare outsiders who were found and rescued as I had been. I could speak their languages often enough to communicate, could explain the nomad ways in terms they might understand, could bridge cultural gaps that others couldn't. Some of these outsiders adapted as I had, finding new lives and new identities. Others could not let go of their old ways and left at the first opportunity, returning to lands and lives they understood. I didn't judge either choice, understanding that adaptation required a flexibility not everyone possessed. Timur grew old but remained strong, his leadership unchallenged, his judgment still sound. When he finally died, peacefully in his sleep after 70 winters, the entire community mourned, and his son took leadership with the same calm competence his father had shown. Zara lived several years longer, becoming the wise woman others consulted, before she too passed, leaving a hole in the community that slowly healed through shared memory and continued practice of what she had taught. Batu lived impossibly long, becoming ancient beyond ancient, a link to a past most people couldn't remember, before finally releasing his grip on life and passing with dignity and grace. His stories lived on, told by those he had taught, including me, passed forward to another generation of children who would need this wisdom to survive. Altan became a leader in his own right, guiding the group after Timur's son, his judgment proven through years of good decisions. He and I remained close friends, brothers in all but blood, our children growing up together, our lives intertwined. Kulan married and had children, becoming one of the strong women who held the community together through skill and determination. And I grew old in my turn, my hair graying, my body marked by years of hard living, but my heart full and my mind at peace. I had found what I hadn't known I was seeking, a life of purpose and belonging, of real skills and genuine community, of connection to land and animals and people in ways my old life had never offered. Now, many years after that desperate winter when I was found half frozen and dying, I sit by the fire in my yurt, watching my grandchildren play, listening to my children discuss plans for tomorrow's travel, feeling the warmth of family and community around me. The cold wind blows outside, bringing the first snows of another winter, but inside we are warm, we are together, we are safe. In a few hours we will sleep as we always sleep, pressed close, sharing warmth and breath, trusting each other through the vulnerable hours of darkness. It is a good way to sleep, a good way to live, a good way to be human. If this story moved you, if it made you think about belonging and adaptation and what humans are capable of when we let go of pride and embrace learning, subscribe to this channel. There are more stories like this, tales of survival and transformation, of ancient wisdom and timeless truths about community and cooperation. Hit the notification bell so you never miss these journeys into other lives and other ways of being. Share this with someone who needs to remember that it's never too late to change, never too late to learn, never too late to find where you truly belong. The tundra is clearing somewhere right now, and nomads are crossing the ice, and they sleep as they have always slept, together, warm in the cold, surviving through the simple but profound practice of taking care of each other through the long, dark nights. The fire burns low, the voices quiet, and soon we will spread the felt mats and arrange the furs and lie down together as families have done for generations beyond counting, as families will do for generations yet to come. The wind howls outside, but we are not afraid. We have each other. We have our knowledge. We have the warmth that comes not from fire alone, but from trust and cooperation and love. This is how we sleep. This is how we survive. This is how we remain human in a land that tests humanity with every frozen breath. And I, Daniel, who became something more than Daniel, sleep peacefully, knowing I found my place in the world, knowing I belong, knowing that the cold cannot touch those who hold each other close through the long, dark winter nights.